Okay, so this is an election recap segment of sorts. This tweet got out there. These are some screenshots from a report from the Financial Times, which we're going to get into. Kanakawa the Great says the woke mind virus is one of the biggest losers of 2024. 30.6 million views with the help of one Elon Musk, of course, who did boost this tweet and retweeted it himself. But the article is called Trump Broke the Democrats' Thermostat. And here's a piece with some data and graphs that we'll go through because this is pretty interesting stuff. In April 2022, Elon Musk tweeted a cartoon made by U.S. evolutionary biologist Colin Wright. The image shows a stick figure representing Wright, a self-described center-left liberal, becoming politically stranded as the American left shifts ever further leftward toward the 2010s, leaving him closer to the right despite his ideology not changing. The graphic was mocked at the time, but recent events suggest it may have a grain of truth to it. So here is the cartoon. You could see the guy, the normie there, standing left of center, and then as the center moves to the left, this guy is perceived to be further right than he actually is. There's the graphic. To be clear, the main reason the Democrats lost the U.S. election is that inflation kills political incumbents. But that doesn't mean there are not other lessons in the results. Data suggests the Democrats lost ground with moderates while holding steady among progressives. Charges that racism propelled voters to Donald Trump are at odds with the rightward swing among black and Hispanic voters, and with a raft of data showing that racial prejudice is in steady decline among Americans of all political stripes. Instead, data shows Democrats taking a sharp turn leftward on social issues over the past decade. This has distanced them from the median voter, just as Wright's cartoon depicted. We see this not only in Democratic voters' self-reported ideology, but in their views on issues including immigration and whether or not minorities need extra help to succeed in society. Notably, the shift began in 2016. This suggests that Trump's election radicalized the left, not the right. Well, I would argue, there's some obviously editorializing here within the piece, which is his right. But what I would argue is that in 2016, he's correct. It did start there. But the reason it started there is because when the left tried to organize around kitchen table issues like the minimum wage and universal health care, they were told by the Democratic Party that they couldn't. They would not be allowed to organize on those grounds. So if they wanted a seat at the table in the Democratic Party, they were going to have to pay more attention to the kinds of cultural issues that Hillary and her team really hit Bernie on very, very hard. Don't forget, they called us racists for wanting to break up the banks. They said, well, how are you going to end breaking up the banks? Isn't going to end racism. So you must be a racist for wanting to break up the banks, or racially insensitive at the very least for wanting to break up the banks. But that being the impetus, this is what has happened here. So Democrats have shifted sharply leftwards on cultural issues in recent years, leaving the median voter behind. So you could see the chart, the year from 1996 until 2020, where you have the median voters sort of spot on the spectrum. The Republicans decently to the right of the median voter on issues like abortion, gun control, things like that. But as you can see, the Democrats, while they used to stay more or less the same distance from the median as the Republicans. In fact, if you look, they were a little closer to the median voter until 2012. And then in 2016, what happened? They were told they couldn't run on the minimum wage. They couldn't run on economics. So what did they do? There's that turn that you see. And now the Republicans are much closer to the center on that issue than the average Democratic voter. Some counter that this is simply what progressive politics is, but the evidence suggests otherwise. See, I would not counter this is what progressive politics is. Progressive's a loaded term right now, but I would say this is not what left politics is.
Well, they stole it.
Right, exactly. Yes, that's why. That's right. America's decades-long progress towards racial and sexual tolerance and equality has been a gradual shift led by progressives, with the center and right quickly following. The pivots of the past decade, by contrast, have been abrupt and are leaving the majority behind. They are better characterized not as moves towards greater tolerance and equality, but as shifts in rhetoric or proposed solutions for addressing disparities where there is plenty of room for disagreement without bigotry. So I would agree with that.
Yes.
Many of these pivots originated with the activists and nonprofit staffers that surrounded the Democratic Party. And an invaluable piece of research carried out in 2021 Political scientists Alexander Furnas and Timothy Lapira at the think tank Data for Progress, found that these political elites or tastemakers hold views often well to the left of the average voter and even the average Democratic voter on cultural issues. So many of the people who shape Democratic Party politics and policy hold views far to the left of the voting population. There you can see the influencer Democratic class is far to the left of even the average Democratic voter. And then you could see the Republican political elites and influencers. They're more or less in line with where their base is on these issues. There's much less distance between those two red sides of the curves than there are the two top blue sides of the curves there. This can create situations where policies and rhetoric alienate the very groups they're aimed at. While 73% of white progressive Democrats favor cutting the size and scope of police forces, only 37% of black Americans agree. A new study by Amanda Sahar-Durso and Marcel Roman at Georgetown and Harvard Universities, respectively, found that the use of the gender-neutral term Latinx used by some progressives was not only deeply unpopular with many Hispanic Americans, but may have actively pushed some towards Trump.
Been saying there was an earlier study that showed that people have been saying this for years, and they refused to listen because they have no other message. This is why these fringe NGOs and groups were able to hijack the conversation of the Democratic Party. Part of what we need to change is defining these ideas as left. These are not left ideas. These are simply bizarre social engineering grifts that are designed. There are a variety of reasons why this has gained currency. Some are more abstract. Okay, so what happens when you're progressive, and you've progressed to a good place on an issue? Well, what happens? Do you fold up your tent and go home? Do you say, okay, mission accomplished? Now, especially if you're an NGO, what do you do after society becomes pretty reasonably tolerant of gay rights, gay marriage passes, gay issues? You have to go find something that's so fringe and so challenging to most people's idea of morality and biology that you can fundraise off it forever. You can fundraise off that shit forever. You're never going to get most people to say, "Oh yeah, no, we should cut children's parts off if they don't gender conform." That's a big part of it. I think that's a big part of where all the gender theater came from. NGOs looking for a way to keep the gravy train going after the passage of gay marriage. Why did it get so much purchase? Why do these ideas get so much purchase in the Democratic Party? How do you justify yourself as a left party with no economic platform?
Right.
Or just a very, very vague, weak, throw crumbs at the peasants kind of an economic platform just to claim some kind of difference from the Republicans? You have to go all in on this. And as you point out, yeah, they did try to orient around economic issues with the Sanders campaign, and the people who stuck with those exited.
Right.
So exactly. Who do you have left? The people who were willing to go on this train. Also, as Jimmy interviewed Parenti recently, he talks about this a lot. It's all an instrument of dividing people from each other, getting them fighting over bullshit. It's very interesting in this article. They're talking about stuff that anyone who's kind of been fighting this battle for a while has been screaming at the top of their lungs, but you couldn't get any coverage on it in non-conservative media. Society has been getting less and less racist, less and less sexist, more and more accepting of gay rights. So this wholesale rejection of what is often termed liberal universalism, probably best summed up by MLK's judging people by the content of their character, it was fucking working. It was working. Had it eradicated all social problems? No. Has anti-racism done that? Has postmodernism done that?
Well, it's interesting you say. I mean, you bring up Martin Luther King as an example, and it's a really good example because, you know, Martin Luther King rallied for the Civil Rights Act, and then after the Civil Rights Act was passed, what did he move on to? Economic rights,
Class. Right.
anti-poverty,
Right.
anti-militarism, and that was obviously intolerable. So after, the landslide victory of Obama in 2008, and no, I'm not saying that cured racism. Of course, that's absurd. But
Right.
after we crossed a major milestone, and yes, as things were starting to improve on that front, what happened? The society moved to a more class based
That's a
critique
good
of power
point.
where you
Right.
had the Tea Party and
Hmm.
Occupy Wall Street both opposing the bank bailouts from different ideological standpoints. But
It's
what
a good
happened? They
observation.
both centered their ire on Wall Street. And that is when this shit started.
Right.
It actually
Right.
predated 2016. 2016 is when it really affected the Democratic Party because you had this hyper engaged group of primary voters, some for Hillary, some for Bernie, and that's when the Democrats really drove that wedge in to make sure that they got all of the class people out. But really before then, when you had the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street screaming about the bank bailouts, that's when this shit started to divide
Yep.
people so that they couldn't
Yep.
unite on class
Yep.
interests.
Yep.
All right, let me keep going. Political party leaders may counter that such gestures come from activists, not politicians, but there is now widespread concern about speech policing among every group of Americans apart from the progressive left.
Yep.
U.S. voters also perceive the Democrats as having moved much further left than the Republicans have shifted right in recent years. These shifts, layered on top of increasing education polarization, are changing the image of the Democratic Party in voters' minds. Survey data shows that in every election from 1948 to 2012, American voters' image of the Democrats was as the party that stood up for the working class and the poor. In 2016, that flipped. Now it is seen primarily as the party of minority advocacy. So this is one of the really
Yep.
telling graphs here. As you can see, going back to halfway through the 20th century, people perceived the Democrats as representing working people. And then what happened? I mean, you could see this through the Reagan years, through the Clinton years. That was on a downward trajectory, but it just bottomed out in 2016 when they sabotaged the Bernie Sanders campaign. They sabotaged
Right.
the working class campaign. And so, of course, people then perceived it more as basically a diversity cult, which is what
Right.
the
Right.
whole stronger together Hillary
Right.
Clinton
Right.
love Trump's hate
Yeah,
thing was
they
all
earned
about.
it. They earned it. What did you think?
Yeah.
This is something else I've been screaming for years. What do you think's going to happen with male voters if you continue this kind of a charm offensive on men? Like, what do you think's going to happen? Do you think they're going to continue to vote for you? There's this aristocratic assumption with these people, and I find the kinds of people who are attracted to this range from the naive to the conformist to the real narcissistic bullies. A lot of narcissistic bullies are attracted to this for the same reason that in earlier ages, very often the most religious people were using the religion as a cudgel to beat people with. A lot of people like that are attracted to this, and those people are repulsive. Hey, Me Too, I'm not saying it was not addressing a real social problem. It very quickly became a cudgel with which to beat up on men to an extent that was on all men are rapists inside, right? All men are dangerous. What did you think would happen? Let's say even if you agree with that point of view, what did you think was going to happen? Anyone's going to ultimately vote for people who say they're against that, right? Right? I mean, what did you think the end result was going to be?
All right. So there's a couple more things here because the big one is actually coming up. Even bigger than that, I would argue, at least as it pertains to the 2024 election result. This evolution has reduced the salience of class and economic solidarity, a domain in which Furness and Lapira find Democratic elites more in tune with the public than their Republican counterparts, and elevated sociocultural issues where the GOP is on firmer ground. As predicted, this resulted in racial realignment on November 5th, with Hispanic and black conservatives voting increasingly in line with their social values rather than their economic priorities. So that is huge. And now let me just demonstrate what he means by that. Now, this graph is a little hard to figure out at first sight. They could have made a little simpler version, but you get the picture. So in 2012, you see the percentage 0 to 100, Democrats on the lower end, Republicans on the higher end. You see the percentage of people in each of these groups who vote Republican. So in 2012, with Obama on the ballot and, still running on somewhat of an economic message, although by that time it had been completely, if I would argue, diluted since the sort of Occupy Wall Street days, even the very conservative black voters voted overwhelmingly Democratic. As you can see on the left side, that leftmost graph, black voters on the very conservative side of the graph voting about 15% for the Republican candidate. This year, 2024, go to the extreme right graph, very conservative black voters voted over 50% for the Republican candidate, which shows you that because there has been this void created on economic issues, now people are more inclined to vote based on their cultural preference. They liked Obama, so it didn't bother. Look, Latino voters, because they generally liked Obama, they saw some economic difference between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, right? I mean, that was another point of it. That, Obama had screwed the working people in his first term, but the Republicans ran a cartoonishly out-of-touch rich man, right? So there was still seen as some sort of class difference, which means even very conservative Latinos voted majority Republican, but not overwhelmingly, just over 50%. In 2024, very conservative Latinos voted, 90% for Trump? And as you could see, as class has been eliminated from the discourse, people tend to vote more based on cultural preference. So in 2016, which was seen as a really, turning point of a year, according to this article, and it was in a certain respect, I agree, although I think the Occupy Wall Street thing was when it really started. But by 2016, you could see, very conservative black voters voted over 25% for Trump, whereas the time before that, they voted only about 15% for Trump. Same thing. You see increases all across the board where culture matters, where class is absent. That's the lesson. Where class is absent, culture is amplified. And that is a big part of what screwed the Democrats this year. In addition to, obviously, the main driver is shit costs too much. But this is why you have shifts toward the Republicans, even in urban areas, which we're going to get to in our next segment.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think in addition, the cultural positions went beyond what reasonable people could consider about basic fairness.
Right.
And with the shit with gender, again, you're going after people's kids. That's not a good look, especially with conservatives.
Well, that's represented here.
I live in Harlem. I live in Harlem. Harlem has the most churches per capita in the country. How do you think they feel about a lot of this? Because it's gone beyond let's let everybody have their basic rights. And it has gone towards something that plays more as indoctrination and social engineering. And you were inevitably going to get a counter reaction to that. And this was always part of what was so fantastical about this whole movement, if you want to call it that. This vision that you had this heteronormative white patriarchy versus everyone else. And the everyone else all had common interests, common opinions. Only white people were conservative, which, as you can see from the polling, they're the most aligned to these ideas of all groups in society. It was always bound to implode under the weight of its own contradictions.
Please clap.